I hope everybody is staying as safe and sane as possible during these unique and interesting times. I'd like to welcome you to our first Crown Center seminar of the 2020-21 academic year. This event is co-sponsored, we're proud to say, by the Islamic and Middle East Studies Program, the Department of Politics, Department of History, and the International and Global Studies Program. Of course, we'd all like to be meeting in person, but we're experimenting with this new format, as David Patel will explain. And one advantage is that we have a very large audience, so that's very encouraging. And I hope that you will tune in again for our next Crown Center seminar on November 4th, which will feature Hiba Akar of Columbia University, speaking on the intriguing and ominous subject of planning Beirut for the next war. So I want to turn things over now to David Patel, the Associate Director of Research at the Crown Center, who's going to moderate this discussion, with Golnar Nikpour, a professor of history at Dartmouth, and Peter Krause, professor of political science at Boston College, and we'll have a discussant from our own research staff, Hayal Arkusa. So with that, I'll turn things over to David. I should mention we're very pleased to welcome Golnar and Peter back to the Crown Center. Both of them were junior research fellows at the center and have gone on to have very successful careers afterwards. So we claim some credit for their success. So David, I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you, Gary, and thank all of you for joining us. Prior to the pandemic, scholars of the Middle East and North Africa faced daunting and arguably worsening field access and research challenges, including fractured states, civil wars, increasing oppression, and the COVID-19 crisis, which has hit several countries in the region particularly hard, but has closed borders throughout the world, has compounded many of these challenges and added new ones, such as the challenge and need to be socially distant from people you're talking to. This moment demands rethinking how we can do fieldwork in these challenging situations and what we might learn from doing fieldwork during this period for the future. And I'm thrilled to have three excellent panelists to discuss this with us. As Gary mentioned, we're welcoming back Peter, who was a Junior Research Fellow in 2011 and 2012, and Golnar, who was the Neubauer Junior Fellow from 2017 to 18. Peter's specialty is international security and political violence. He's a political scientist and recently co-edited a volume, which I highly recommend for you, published by Columbia University Press this year, I think, called Stories from the Field, a guide to navigating fieldwork in political science. Golnar, who's a historian, works on prisons and punishment in 19th to 21st century Iran, and especially the expansion of the Iranian prison system and public discourses around that expansion in an era of in a globalized mass incarceration context. She works with archives, she does interviews in Iran, and has visited a number of these prisons. Being the discussant is Hayal Arkusa, who's an anthropologist from a different perspective, who works on policing, human rights, and the transnational flow of best practices and international expertise. Her work includes 18 months of multi-sited fieldwork in Turkey, including participant observation, police training, and police operations, and visiting families and the effects of these police operations on families' daily lives. So before we dive right in, I'm going to ask each of our speakers to speak for 10 minutes, which will leave plenty of time for Q&A. We have both the Q&A section open and the chat section open. And the way we envision this unfolding is, if you'd like to ask questions of the panelists, please submit them via the Q&A function, which the panelists will all be able to see. Please do not submit your questions via the chat function, but you can use the chat function for general discussion and clarification, but the panelists will not be moderating the chat during the session, although other members of the Crown Center staff will be. I'd also like to mention that you are being recorded, so please be aware of that. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Peter for 10 minutes. And Peter, please go ahead.
Great. Well, thank you so much, David and Gary, for the great introduction. And thank you so much to the Crown Center for having me back. The year I spent at the Crown Center was a very formative time for me. It was when I was transitioning from finishing up my PhD, which I just did, to becoming a faculty member at BC. And, I really think of that time fondly. So thank you for having me back. Just a little bit of my own background on fieldwork, and I'll get into my thoughts on fieldwork today amidst the pandemic. So I spent a number of years living in a variety of Middle East countries, mostly focused in Levant. When I researched my first book, which was looking at national movements, particularly the Zionist movement and the Palestinian national movement. And a lot of my work involved interviews, involved archival research. I've subsequently gone back to the region to do research on the phenomenon of price tag and relations between Israeli settlers and Palestinians in the West Bank. And then I've lived in Algeria on a number of occasions, also to work on the book to study the Algerian national movement. As David mentions, I have this book that just came out over the summer, co-edited volume on fieldwork, and also there's actually an article we have forthcoming with contributors to the volume on fieldwork amidst COVID-19. So amidst my remarks, I'm going to not only say some of my own thoughts on fieldwork, but also try to amplify some of those voices and their experiences. So first, in a broad sense, I just want to say quickly, like, why do we do fieldwork? I think it's important to explain why we do this stuff. I think first and foremost, we want to understand a region and the politics of it, at least for me, in a very deep way. We want to know what questions we should be asking and how to ask them, because I don't think necessarily from our desks in Boston or wherever else we necessarily know that stuff. We want to understand the perceptions of the people in a region without imposing our own, building empathy, if not sympathy, for the people in the regions that we're studying. I think we want to get access to information that maybe we can't get from our home institutions. We want to make connections and friends and build kind of lifelong relationships, particularly with countries and regions that we're going to study and try to be quote unquote experts in. And ultimately, I think, again, this is not said as much, but it's an important thing. And probably for anyone out there watching who's a graduate student, young faculty member, you're thinking about this stuff, it's also honestly a way that you build credibility in your area. How could you say that you're an expert of so-and-so country if you've never been there before, if you've never spoken the language, if you've never interacted with people from that place? And so whether you're doing field experiments or whether you're doing ethnography, I think fieldwork is an essential aspect of learning about a region and a people. So in terms of the challenges before COVID of doing fieldwork in the Middle East, I'd say there's a few things. Number one, there are access issues, right? Just being able to get visas to be able to travel to certain countries, to study potential sensitive topics. I'll say from my own experience, when I was trying to do research in Algeria, I had a huge challenge just even getting a visa to get into the country. It's not a common place for Americans to be able to go. Luckily, I was able to partner with a local kind of American-focused research center there, which was able to help me with that. But then getting access to archives there, which are held in the office of the president, was quite a challenging thing. So there were these access issues. And then certainly there's ethical and safety concerns. We all, of course, probably know the story of the Italian student from Cambridge who was doing research in Egypt and was unfortunately probably killed and tortured there in 2016. But also just the broader ethical concerns of, not just thinking about your own safety, but thinking about the safety of those you're interacting with, right? Are you making sure that you are not subjecting them to any problems, whether from the state or otherwise, if you're asking them about sensitive questions? And then I think about a chapter that Mark Lynch wrote in our book, which was the title was Things Change. And especially in the Middle East, as we've seen since the Arab Spring, both before and after, things constantly change. You can't assume that the government that's in power today or the way the society is today is going to be the same way it's going to be tomorrow. And so when you interview people or you do archival work, you do whatever else based on the idea that, okay, these are the existing norms and laws and it's always going to be this way, that can pose a real challenge. You can put people at risk down the line if you publish, say, their name and their interview information, and then all of a sudden there's a change in government and now what that person said is going to become really problematic for them personally. So as David said in the intro, I think a lot of these issues were around before COVID-19. But what has COVID-19 done to fieldwork in the Middle East? I think it has heightened a lot of these issues. So obviously access has become even more problematic because of restrictions on international travel, because of frozen travel budgets for graduate students and faculty members. And then in a broader sense, the idea that you don't obviously want to be a vector of disease or the virus for people in these places you're going to travel to. So that's very important. Also, when we think about ethical concerns, we have to think about the fact that even if people aren't sick, they're facing massive economic challenges, political unrest, etc. And when you're going and doing field work and you're asking people to talk to you or to meet with you or otherwise, you're potentially burdening them. So you want to think about the ethical challenges that are faced when you're designing a research project. And although, IRBs, institutional review boards, can be helpful with that, we shouldn't be thinking that an IRB approval alone is sufficient to say, okay, my project is ready to go. Once the IRB says I can go back in the field, I'm ready to go. We need to really think about this stuff, because just because you or your country has gotten, say, the COVID vaccine doesn't mean that others will, doesn't mean it's going to be 100% effective. So these are real challenges we have to think about going forward. How do we deal with this stuff? I think contingency planning is now a central part of all fieldwork and research designs. And anyone who has done fieldwork before will tell you things never go perfectly according to plan. There are always things that don't work out the way you want, things take longer than you think they will, etc. But now we know we have this massive societal and global challenge. And so I think if you're going to do fieldwork or plan to do fieldwork in the next 1, 2, 3 years, you need to build in contingencies from everything from how could I do that differently if problems arise to how could I actually do a dissertation or a project entirely from my desk if I'm not able to actually travel, because that's a real possibility. And so contingency planning, I think, is really important. Now, what are some of the ways I think you can get around this stuff? Online fieldwork is not the same as being there in person. Anyone who's ever done fieldwork in person will tell you that. But I think there's a lot of things you can do from your desk that still give you exposure to the people and the politics and the society of a different place. And I'm going to go through some examples. First, in terms of archival work, which I've spent a lot of time doing, I was actually trained as much as a historian as a political scientist. When I've been in Israel or I've been in Lebanon or elsewhere, I spent a lot of time in the archives, either state archives or individual group archives like the Jabotinsky archives in Israel or like the Institute for Palestine Studies in Beirut. And thankfully, more and more archives are being digitized. And so you're able to access them, not necessarily in person. So that's helpful. And then in some cases, let's say you can't go to an archive. I had a student who was studying abroad at Aix-en-Provence in France, and that's where they keep their national overseas archives. And I knew exactly the documents I wanted about French intelligence going after some of these Algerian groups during the independence movement. I was able to work with her to have her photograph documents for me as I'm searching for them in boxes or otherwise, and she's helping to send those back. So again, is that the ideal scenario? No, I would rather be there in person, but amidst the pandemic, these are some second best approaches that might be able to work. You can still potentially conduct interviews, although again, it's tough to kind of get people's trust to be able to want to do an interview with you if you haven't met with them before. But there are end-to-end encryption platforms, whether Signal or Telegram or whatnot, where maybe you can start to chat with people a bit, even from afar. But more importantly than just diving into interviews, I think, is working on building your networks. In the volume that we wrote, Amani Jamal and Wendy Perlman both talked extensively about spending non-instrumental time in a fieldwork site, getting to know the people, the culture, the region, not just going in and being like, oh, I've got this perfect survey instrument, I'm going to immediately just start interviewing people. Like, think about the emails that we probably all get from people being like, fill out this survey for me, and like they spell your name wrong or something. Like, how likely are you to actually respond to that? Not very likely. Whereas, hey, if it's some friend or someone you know that's taken the time to get to know you or understand you, and then they ask you for something like that, you're much more likely to help them. Well, guess what? Being someone who does field work, that's what you're building throughout your career. It's not like this kind of smash and grab thing where you just go in, get the data, and run out. Instead, you're trying to build that relationship. You're trying to understand the region, the people that you're interacting with. And this is not just project one. This is hopefully project 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. So I think people can use this time, whether it's virtually or otherwise, to try to start to build some of those non-instrumental connections with the field side or with the people that they're studying in the long term. And again, is it harder to do that online versus in person? It is, but that's still something that's there. Third thing I think you can do, you can work with existing data. Especially dissertations, so much of it is about reinventing the wheel, but guess what? There are massive amounts of survey data, of field notes, of journalistic accounts, etc. Again, is that the same as experiencing yourself? It's not, but it can still be helpful. When I was in Algeria and I couldn't get access to the archives all the time, I was able to get access to Bill Kwan's field notes. He had interviewed many of the people that I would have wanted to interview, and they have now been dead. And he asked a lot of the same questions that I wanted to ask. And so by doing that, I was able to get some information, not ideal, but again, better than not having anything from the field. Final point again, you can partner with people who are in the country that you're trying to study. And this is something that, again, many academics will say, hey, I am trying to work on an issue in X country. I'm not from there. I'll partner with someone from there, which can be nice international collaboration. But particularly in this time when travel is tough, maybe as Zoe Marks and Aliyu Zakayu say in this article we have forthcoming, field researchers can partner with kind of field citizens. And again, giving credit to people who are in those areas doing this type of work, I think is a great way to build research partnerships. So I know if you're a graduate student who's in your 4th year, or you're a faculty member who's in their 3rd year, and you're going up for tenure students, like this is a really tough time. But if you're not in that exact right now scenario, I think that being able to work on your language skills, build networks, plan better, think about how you're asking your research question, those things can still be done from afar in an ethical way. And when all of a sudden things go back to at least relatively normal, you'll be ready to soar. So those are some initial comments on it. I welcome the questions. And again, thanks for having me.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter. There's a lot there to chew on and discuss. Golnar?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for having me and for inviting me to speak on this fascinating panel and for making this event happen. This is a really good example, actually, of the type of flexibility that we all need to continue doing the work that we want to do on the topics that we want to do. But I just want to take a moment to say how pleased I am to be working, to have this opportunity to be virtually at the Crown Center again. So thank you, David, Gary, Christina, Karen, Marilyn, everybody at the Crown Center. I really appreciate this, and Peter and Hayal as well. So Peter, you actually covered a lot of, I think, the ground that one could cover on this topic. So what I'm going to do, and what I've been kind of asked to do, is to talk a little bit more specifically about the types of work that I've done, and try to think about the types of flexibility that I've had to learn in order to research the topic that I'm currently writing on. So as David mentioned, I'm a historian of modern Iran, of modern Iranian intellectual political history, and I'm in the process of finishing a book on the history of prisons and punishment in Iran. And more than an institutional history, it's a look at the way that carcerality has changed the way that people live and think, what it means to all of a sudden start to experience life as surveilled, as potentially arrested, potentially punished. And even before the pandemic, of course, doing research, doing field research in Iran poses some meaningful challenges for those of us who are based in the US, regardless of topic. And doing research on prisons more broadly anywhere in the world is a difficult task. I mean, regardless of where you're interested in researching prisons or policing, you're going to come up against access issues. This means that on some level, we have to let go of the feeling that there is something like a complete project, something like a project where you actually get every single piece of data. And I think that this is something I learned very early on in my project, that the sense of completionism, the desire to truly look at every single document that's out there is actually going to hurt you rather than help you. I mean, having said that, I also spent several years reading as much as I could, finding as much as I could, visiting archives across the US, Europe, and the Islamic Republic, to try to make what I was looking at come to life in a three-dimensional way, to look capaciously at the topic of prison. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of what I mean by that. In researching my book, as I said, I traveled to, I don't even know how many archives across several different continents. But given the difficulties that I faced in finding all of the material that I wanted, I mean, I also had many doors closed, not only in Iran, but in just trying to do research on the topic of prisons and carcerality more broadly. For instance, when I started to do research on my book, I didn't know, it hadn't occurred to me that a big part of the book would be looking at the establishment of the field of criminology in Iran in the 20th century, and thinking about and learning that several criminologists, both in the Pahlavi era and now in the Islamic Republic era, have worked directly with the governments, the respective governments, to quote unquote, sort of make the prisons more humane, more scientific, more rational, more modern. And that is something that both the Pahlavi government and the Islamic Republic government say that they do, that they're trying to punish as efficiently and rationally and humanely as possible to have the best possible outcomes. And I learned that a lot of this discourse was coming from the world of criminology. So it's as simple as thinking that when I would put in a search, whether in a WorldCat search or an archive in Iran, and I would just search prisons, I would actually get a fairly limited number of texts, right? In the US, in WorldCat, you might get some prison memoirs, you might get some academic texts. But if I expanded just thinking about what I was searching for, crime, criminality, policing, punishment, eventually, I was looking up databases of films for like cop and robber film, trying to think about, if you think expansively and historically, the way that people experienced these, legal centralization, new forms of policing, new forms of punishment, wasn't all through the state. It was through, we might all know our Miranda rights from having watched Law and Order, right? So to try to think as capaciously about what it means to be looking archivally as possible. I mean, ultimately, I'm a historian, so my interest is thinking through archives, but I started to think as sort of broadly about what that meant, that basically everything can be an archive, a historical archive. The buildings themselves are historical archives. The people in them are historical archives. The, data that you might find online. And I completely agree with the point that Peter raised, that even another person's research can become archival material for you. So as I was looking through these 20th and 21st century criminological texts, I found that there was an enormous amount of data in them that had been collected by other researchers asking very, very different types of questions than I was interested in. But I was still able to repurpose that material towards the story that I wanted to tell. And I think that that's going to be possible for future researchers, hopefully from my own research, right? Like not everyone is going to have the, temperamentally or personally going to be interested in the same things I'm interested in. But the work might be there. Some of the materials might be there to allow folks to look at the questions that they're the most intrigued by. So again, I mean, I'm to repeat the major point, it's to be flexible when you're searching and to cast as wide of a net as possible. Now, if you can't do the field work that you hope to do, that's a real letdown, right? I think that living with that disappointment or sort of, allowing yourself to feel it is okay. Allowing yourself to feel frustrated that you can't answer certain questions is okay. But you have to put that aside to some extent. As I said, put aside the idea of the project that the abstract idea of the project that you have to begin with, and start getting into what you can look at. What are the questions you can ask? What is the material saying to you? And I promise you that even if you're only looking at archival materials that are digitized and online, there are going to be new questions that pop up the more you read. So really casting as wide of a net as you can and reading as broadly as you can is the key, I would say. And this is true for scholar, and I'll speak specifically to the Iranian context. Ultimately, a lot of historians that work on Iran have limited access to Iranian archives. It's complicated in getting a visa. For those who might have national paperwork to get in and out of more than one country, that might come with its own headaches, its own worries. I personally worried about the safety and security of folks that I was talking to. I wanted to make sure that people felt comfortable, and they're just naturally not going to feel as comfortable speaking online, even if you know them. So it's important to think about things like what software is more encrypted, what software is more relatively secure, if you know folks that are in any given context, what are the apps that they feel most comfortable using, let them sort of set the tone, even if it's just a matter of they're, scanning some things in an archive for you and it's a scholar in another place and they're going to just scan some things in and email them to you. You want them to feel comfortable doing so and confident that that's not going to lead to any issues for them down the road. So flexibility, listening to folks and listening to what it is that they're saying really went a long way for me. When I was when I go to Tehran, I spent a lot of time not only in the archives, but also in just the sort of used booksellers corridor near the University of Tehran, just talking to people, telling people what I'm interested in, sitting around, chatting about things, letting things that don't seem as big a part of the research process, be a big part of that process, letting other people into some amount of your interests, people that you trust, so that they can help you down the road. Those contacts and those relationships that I built have been really integral for me in this time that I'm not able to travel, right? I'm able to contact people and say, oh, have you seen this book? Do you know if, such and such a text is available widely? Do you know if such and such a, pamphlet or document is available? So making those connections, reaching out to scholars. And in the Iranian case, I'll say that scholars in Iran are frustrated by their own inability to access things in Euro-American context because of travel restrictions that are placed on this end on them. They're facing a lot more restrictions than, for our own frustrations about restrictions, the scholars in Iran are facing much worse access issues outside of the Iranian context than we sometimes imagine. So I have found that contacting folks and really thinking about myself as part of a broader Iranian studies network that includes the scholars who are working in Iran has been really integral, because in the first place, we are part of a broader community, and it's sometimes, although you don't get very much professional credit in the US for knowing scholars in the Middle East, it will greatly enhance your work if you're actually on top of the scholarship that's coming out in your home place, the place that you're actually studying. And then it can actually be, there can be exchanges. Thinking about that, not just about what folks can do for you, but about the ways that you can broaden conversations and broaden archive bases for scholars who are working across the Middle East, I think is actually really valuable. Thinking of yourself as a kind of, we don't want to be disease vectors, but as a vector for scholarship and of archives, that your archive at some point at some point down the road, you might feel comfortable sharing. And actually thinking of yourself as not simply in transactional relationships with people, but actually trying to build relationships with people in ways that are organic and can help more than just your own career, I think is extremely rewarding ultimately. And it's fun too. You get to know what people are working on. And so I just kind of want to end there to reiterate the point that I think it's enormously helpful as a historian to be familiar with the research that's coming out in Persian, Arabic, Turkish, Hebrew, whatever, Kurdish, whatever languages folks are working in, to familiarize yourself with that material too, because it might help you actually understand what archival sources are and are not available to scholars in other places, and to try to think about the ways that you can kind of tap into those networks. Now, in the post-COVID moment, again, these things are all happening virtually. But one of the really great things is that in the last 6 months, there has been some effort towards digitizing more archives. Everyone has kind of hit the same walls. And so there has been more openness and expansion of what our digital archive is, which is, I think, going to be really crucial for scholars going forward. The more access that we have, there's no substitution for archival fieldwork, or for fieldwork with individuals, or for interviews, or for all of the things that we love to do. But at the same time, these access issues they predate COVID and they're going to post-date COVID. So the more that we actually manage the more networks of digital archivization that we find, the better. And I would just like to recommend one particular website, which is the weblog called Hazine, Hazine. And they started in 2013, but they relaunched in 2018 and have really expanded what they're doing. And their website is just a kind of clearinghouse for information about digital archives in Islamic studies and Middle East studies broadly. So it's a whole bunch of different scholars writing either blog posts about where you can find things. They just posted something on doing digital research on Afghanistan. And I had no idea just how much digital material was available. And part of that started because of the fact that for the last, half a century, you really can't easily do archival or fieldwork research in Afghanistan because of the various wars. So scholars have been thinking about that for a long time. And then there's this terrific website that has, one researcher wrote a post with all of these different digital sources that you can look at. Again, not a substitution, but the idea is that there are now people who are specifically working on these issues of access. For the first time, the Iranian National Archive made some resources digital. There are digital resources of Iranian opposition materials that have been expanded in the last year, and so on and so forth. So really, if you're looking for something, the first step would be to reach out to a researcher who's done some of the research, on topics that are similar, and trying to see if they have any, if they know of archives that you don't know of. For folks working on Iran, there's also there are also online systems where you can order books or other materials that are produced in, because of sanctions, it's hard to even get books from Iran, but there are ways that people have found to get around this. Whatever it is, you're not inventing the wheel, right? For many generations, Middle East scholars have been trying to get access to materials that are hard to get access to. So the first step, if you're starting a project and really don't know, is reaching out and asking. And I think this is a topic that most folks who work on the region are going to be eager to talk about, because I, for instance, want all the more people working on Iran, all kinds of people working on topics and actually really reading and doing the difficult work of finding the materials, and not just kind of, extemporizing based on two things that they've read about Iran in the past. So yeah, ask questions and try to find the sources out there that are already long-standing. All right, so I'll stop there and see if there's questions. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Golnar. That was terrific. For those of you who've joined us late, I'd just like to remind everybody, if you have questions specifically for the panelists, I encourage you to submit them via the Q&A function. If you have general discussion or things you'd like to ask otherwise that you don't want the panelists to specifically address, you can put those in the chat. But please don't ask questions directed towards the panelists in the chat, because we won't necessarily see them. And so finally, I'd like to turn things over to Hayala Karsu, who's currently a Junior Research Fellow at the Crown Center.
Thank you, David. Golnar, Peter, as a current Junior Research Fellow in the Crown Center, it's a really pleasure to welcome you back for this much needed discussion. I was amazed by the breadth and depth of your comments and insights, and thank you very much. I have two sets of comments / questions, both for you and for the general discussion. While we are holding this event to discuss field research in the Middle East during and after the pandemic, we should all acknowledge, as you did and David did at the beginning, that many countries or some research sites in the Middle East were almost closed for research well before the pandemic. This was either because of armed conflicts, as in Syria and Yemen, or because of government restrictions, sanctions on research, as in Iran, or because of crackdown on scholars and criminalization of social research in places like Turkey, Egypt, and you name it. Or remember what people in Gaza said when the COVID outbreak started. The coronavirus finally gave the world a chance to feel what we Gazans have always felt, a state of lockdown and restrictions on the mobility, to name the few. Indeed, with COVID, some might say that there are actually more forms of connectedness. There are conferences and events online that people can access from their homes from anywhere in the world, provided that they have reliable internet. As researchers, it's easier for us now to interview people over Zoom, phone, or by using other social media platforms. One question that I have for you both, do you think that the pandemic, in a way, has opened up new spaces, sites for research in the Middle East? Spaces that probably wouldn't have been accessible to researchers before the pandemic. Either way, the issue of remote research raises for me related concern, given the history of colonial and imperialistic knowledge production on the Middle East. I worry that long-distance research will generate a new generation of armchair anthropologists or ivory tower researchers who are mostly based in the elite institutions of the global north, like some of us or like other people in the audience, to be honest, doing research at distance on the Middle East, right? So how can we avoid replaying this extractive and to a certain extent colonial research practice during and after the pandemic? Indeed, can we take this moment of health crisis, and I add environmental crisis, which exposed inequalities in the Middle East and beyond, to rethink our whole research praxis? I mean, how can we rethink the field research in the Middle East during and after the pandemic, not just to develop contingency plans for saving the day, but to change the way we do our research projects with and for the people in the Middle East, not just on them? how to give back to our research communities, how to develop collaborative projects. Golnar mentioned a little bit about this. To clarify, I don't mean just outsourcing of research to low or never paid research assistants because we can travel. Instead, how can we make the whole process more collaborative and engage with the social and political concerns of people we study? My second set of questions are more related with the issue of digitalization and digital research tools. I'm an anthropologist, and as David introduced, I did an ethnography of police in Turkey, in the police academy, and police stations, and in other institutional settings. I can't even imagine being able to do the research I did back in 2015, 2017 right now. That's not just because of the political situation in Turkey, but also issues related to research mechanics, right? Building trust, getting access, navigating bureaucracies, and I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A. But still, what I found out during my field research on police reforms in Turkey, that there are already many visual and textual materials, digital materials accessible for researchers. In the field, for instance, I made use of digital materials produced by Turkish National Police a lot, as they were trying to cultivate digital presence for PR work, for community outreach, or as part of other projects related to the digitalization of governmental services and resources. I bring this up because I see many graduate students frustrated because of COVID-related travel restrictions to their research sites. They worry that they will not be able to access what they need to conduct their projects, but there are many materials, as Golnar and David also mentioned, that they are already available for research and analysis. We should remind ourselves that things we study, ideas, humans, institutions, infrastructures, objects, they do also have some sort of digital life, all of which can be objects of study. Instead of reinventing the wheel, we can also build on, for instance, research on cultural and media products, which is indeed a strong suit of the Middle East scholarship. Golnar's presentation also made me to think the very process of state-sponsored digitalization of archives and other resources. Would it be possible for you, Golnar, to talk more about the process? What gets digitalized? What kinds of decision makings are involved in the process? What some practical suggestions can you offer to researchers who plan to utilize such resources in their research designs? This brings me to my last point. My research among the police also made me realize another scary fact, that Big Brother is not only watching us, but also stalking us on social media, or generating data on us by using various algorithms that track our online as well as offline lives. That's what police in Turkey and in other places call open source intelligence. Instead of secret policies hiding in secret corners, there are police officers who are actually working on social media units, sitting on their desks, doing hashtag research on to profile political dissidents, to learn about the time and location of their protests, so on and so forth. They gather intelligence from publicly available sources, things people already share on their websites, social media profiles, and so on. Or they make use of crowdsourced intelligence, asking ordinary people to inform on one another. Turkish police, for instance, has online informing apps, asking ordinary citizens, let's call them cyber patrols or digital vigilantes, to take a screenshot of any suspicious activity online and file a complaint to the police. And it's very common in Turkey, in Egypt, and in many other places in the Middle East that people are jailed just because of their comments on social media. Add to this all other digital surveillance and tracking tools and technologies that governments in the region have invested in. Against this background, my question is, how should we avoid the unwarranted attention of security and police forces while doing remote research in the Middle East? How can we manage the digital footprints of our research projects on the Middle East, a region that is central to various security and military interests? How are we going to ensure our safety as scholars, especially as scholars from the region? More importantly, how can we protect the safety of our research partners, educators in the Middle East, our colleagues in the region who are living with greater risks? And final, maybe a rather rhetorical question to Peter, as he talked about contingency planning. When should we say no to the research, shift the gears back? As we are all trying to navigate our ways in the midst of a global pandemic, how should we add cool off, pause button in our research designs? Thank you.
Thank you, Hayal. That was terrific. And we'll go over past 12 a little bit since there's so many excellent questions and issues that have been raised. I'm going to add a few. Thank you for those who submitted questions via the Q&A, and please continue to do so. I can almost feel the angst from some of the people asking questions about how to start their project or how to conduct their project, the fear they fear for friends and family members in the region whom they're turning to help complete work. And I think you all expressed how all of us are feeling at this moment. So I'm going to ask there are a number of questions about practicalities, looking for specific advice on how to conduct effective and safe interviews over Skype or WhatsApp. If you have any suggestions on how best to do it, how interview techniques might be different or similar if they're done digitally or online, the challenges of gaining trust or maintaining trust online, especially from one discussant who's one questioner who's just starting out their dissertation work, it sounds like, and is trying to do almost pre-field work to get a sense of what they can do without knowing many people. There was also a set of questions linked to that on ethical concerns to consider when conducting interviews over the internet. And I think a lot of the issues Hayal raised directly linked to that, digital footprints, as she says. And also a series of questions about discomfort or challenges of using family and friends to visit archives, to gather material for you, especially at this time, and how you compensate perhaps people financially or otherwise who may want to remain anonymous. There was also a series of questions about positionality and the issue of safety for informants, respondents, subjects, depending on what discipline you come from. We tend to use the different phrases, but also for marginalized and at-risk populations. And especially somebody was kind of blunt in the Q&A, like how do we address the question of, quote, what gives you the right to do this fieldwork, especially during a pandemic? So the general positionality issue and how it's changed during this. So feel free. We'll go to Golnar, Peter, and then perhaps Hayal if you'd like to add anything. Just a few minutes, and we'll be another round of questions. And then feel free to address any of the issues that have been raised or questions.
Yeah, thank you, Hayal, for those terrific comments. Really, really amazing comments, and David, and all of the questions. I was trying to keep things relatively upbeat in my comments in some sense, because I think research is challenging, and this is a really hard time to be a scholar. But having said that, I actually, take to heart, especially the comments that Hayal, your comments on armchair anthropologists and the sort of colonial gaze and the incredible power dynamics, sort of power imbalances that exist even in the best of times for people in institutions like ours doing research on the region that we call the Middle East. Right. These are issues that are, again, predate the pandemic and will post-date it, but which the pandemic exacerbates. We know that the pandemic, whether in the US or in the Middle East, exacerbates power imbalances, income disparities, health outcomes. And I do think that means that you have to sometimes say no to the project. I cannot answer the question of how others can have a moral compass, but I think that it is imperative to think about power with whatever research question you may have, to think about your own relative power. In some cases, you may feel that you have relative lack of power in some cases, especially folks who have lives in multiple places, families in multiple places, who are worried about real life effects of their research. But not only the real life effects on themselves, even if I maybe did or didn't worry about myself or my family in Iran, which I did sometimes, I thought all the time about the reality of, traveling somewhere, doing research for however long, 6 months, a year, 1 month, 2 days, 10 years, it doesn't matter. But then coming back to my institutions, and now I got a job, maybe I'll get a promotion. Those are real issues that are things that researchers should be thinking about. The fact that we can leverage the work that we do into sometimes like great rewards for ourselves, but not great rewards for those whom we work with in various places. I mean, sometimes they're fine and well remunerated. There might be a librarian or a researcher who's okay, but there might be times when you're really leaning on people who are not going to see the rewards of your work. And to think about what that means. Again, I can't, we all have different lines, but we have to remember that these are ultimately mediated by colonial and post-colonial legacies, by state surveillance in some cases, by issues that are not easily hand-waved, right? You can't just say, well, I thought about it, I wrote a good paragraph on the risks and rewards, and now it's okay. Like I'm a completely like, you might, basically listen to yourself. If you feel uncomfortable, or if somebody feels uncomfortable with what you're doing, that's a really good moment to stop and rethink. That's pandemic related or otherwise, right? Like in the pandemic, I've noticed that like occasionally you'll still see people getting close to talk to somebody and the person recoil. That's like a good reminder when you're doing research on the Middle East. If you perceive that people are feeling uncomfortable with your questions or with the research that you're doing, then that's as good of a sign as any that you might need to rethink your methods, right? Now I'm in a different situation than those who do a lot of interviews. I mean, I conducted some, but my work is mainly with texts, and texts, you have a responsibility to texts and to history as well, but it's a slightly different kind of responsibility than the one that you have to people who might be in more grave danger or immediate danger. Again, whether, not just, basically anywhere, right? And I think that some of the questions people have about online trust, ethical concerns, digital footprints are, ultimately, they're not going to have happy answers, right? There is really no way to replicate in an era of digital surveillance the same kind of trust that you would have. I mean, I talked to people who asked that I turn off my phone, and I do research on policing and incarceration in the U.S. as well, and sometimes you just, people don't want to be around their digital object to have those conversations, let alone be online. So ultimately, I think that there are just some doors that might be closed, and to not think of that as something that is going to stop you altogether, but to rather think how you could ask questions more broadly, and to ask questions about how those power dynamics work, like how the digital footprint works, how, one of the things I research in the Iranian context is things like biometrics and facial recognition software, and those types of global surveillance softwares and techniques. And so it's asking questions about those forms of power. And then I'll just say one last thing, which is, the question of how do we, compensation is a really hard question in the Middle East. Like with Iran, sanctions make it really challenging. And I've had to just come up with really sometimes quite convoluted and like certainly in a gray zone of legality ways to try to like buy things or compensate people. And I don't have a good answer for that beyond just like trying to be as fair-minded as possible. But the one thing I would say is to really, really take seriously the scholarship that's happening in these places as scholarship, and to cite it as scholarship the way that you would with anything else. If there's one pet peeve that I have, is that people just don't take the Persian language scholarship as seriously. Even those who can read it, right? They don't cite it they don't quote it, they don't cite it, they don't treat it with the same level of respect that it deserves. And that is, to me, 101 of trying to, you're not going to get tenure because a professor at the University of Shiraz writes you a letter, but that doesn't make that relationship a less valuable one. And it is incumbent on us to think about the fact that it is the vicissitudes of history and that make it so that that person's voice is less powerful on the global stage. But we don't have to replicate those, we don't have to just give in to those power dynamics. We can think about them and try to think seriously about what it means to take scholarship coming from all of these places with the same seriousness that we give each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are great points by Golnar and Hayal. I really appreciate your comments and questions. Those are fantastic, as well as David's. I think you guys gave us about 35 great questions to answer. So I'm going to pick 4 and leave aside the other 20, 25 for now or whatever else. And I'm happy to chat more if people want to communicate. So real quick, I'll say this. On the armchair experts in extractive research, I think that term extractive is unfortunately, it's a very negative term, but it's a correct term, Hayal. I think that's the type of fieldwork we don't want to do in any environment, let alone one amidst a pandemic. So how do you not do extractive research? I mean, I think in a basic sense, beyond just, hopefully learning the language of the place you're studying and showing respect to the people there, that you're giving back in some way too. And some people might think, well, how do you give back? And so I think there's a lot of things. One is what Golnar mentioned. First and foremost, making sure you're crediting the local institutions and individuals who help you, whether it's, in a basic line, hopefully like acknowledgements, but even more so if people are doing things that are up to the level of being a co-author otherwise, that should be there. And, one of the things I've talked about in a recent workshop on fieldwork ethics is, we have this model in academia where it's like you're a co-author or you're kind of nothing but a thank you. And like, is there another future model, more like movie credits or something, where you are saying more explicitly, these are people who work in the archives, or whatever. And because you realize all the people and all the work that goes into an article, let alone a book. And a lot of that doesn't really get credited the way that it should. So that's number one. Karen Fisher in the comments asked an interesting question about anonymity. I mean, that's a really challenging one. If on the one hand, you need anonymity so the regime doesn't crack down on you, but on the other hand, you want everyone to know your name and what you did, I'm not sure exactly how you thread that needle, minus, maybe it's you use a pen name, but then people in the field know who that person's pen name is. That's the best I can come up with, but that's a tough kind of, again, needle to thread if you have both of those concerns with a co-author. But other things you can give back on. You can help people in terms of training of research methods. Many of us are very privileged to be able to have some decent background in various methodological training, and people in many other countries have it as well. But sometimes the enumerators you work with, the people you work with, don't as much, so you get that kind of training. Maybe you give some research access. Golnar talked about how people in some of these other countries can't get access to certain documents, et cetera. Again, as long as you're following the laws of your country, just as they're helping you gain access, maybe you can. Maybe you can reach out to these local institutions you want to affiliate with and say, hey, are there things that I can help you with that you guys are having trouble with, with the United States or otherwise? And then again, it becomes a partnership as opposed to an extractive, go in, get what you need, get out, see you later kind of relationship. But yeah, I think in a broad sense, we're going to learn a lot about people's ethics in a time like this, right? I think about like a basic analogy or sports analogy is, okay, when the pressure's on, you really learn what someone's about. And one of the things I think we should all think about is as hiring committees and as faculty, this is going to be a big thing in job talks the next few years, is people aren't necessarily going to be able to come in with the same quality or type of fieldwork for their research as we've been used to. So do we then just kind of take whoever has the best project and not look at how they got it or what the ethical considerations were? Or do we think about the choices that they made and see what their potential is as a scholar, regardless of whether they got, the exact type of project we're used to seeing before? I think hiring committees and people on journal boards are going to have a big impact on that. And so certainly in political science, I think anthropology, Hayal, you can speak better to this than I can, but I think you guys are far ahead of poli-sci in this way. But poli-sci in recent years has done better about people explicitly talking about their ethical choices and why they have the research designs they do. I think the pandemic could and should heighten that significantly, and that should be a key part of the consideration here, again, for publishing, for hiring, etc. In terms of some of the other questions, I don't think you have to reinvent the wheel on all this ethical stuff. I agree with Golnar's point that like not everyone's going to have the same ethical standards, but I also don't think you have to come at it from nowhere, right? Like there's great resources out there for political scientists. APSAS had a bunch of standard. Diana Kapajewski, who just chaired a panel on this, has done stuff. If you go to the Social Science Research Council, Kanisha Bond, Millie Lake, Sarah Parkinson, Elizabeth Wood, many people have written articles on these exact issues about how to deal with these ethical challenges. So I think you should develop your own standards for what you're comfortable with, but you can also draw on experienced people out there. That's in many ways why we wanted to do this co-edited volume, because we were like, look, there's not one size fits all for fieldwork. Some people do ethnography, some people do participant observation, some people do archives, some people do interviews, but you know, let's hear from people who have done this before, the choices they've made, so you can kind of chart your own path. And so I think that's a good way to go. Final point on in-person ethnography and some of the challenges of making connections from abroad and when to say no and shift back. You know, I think you can do a couple things, right? Number one is, I think Golnar mentioned before, making connections via scholars who have done the work already is a helpful thing. Maybe they have information they can help you with. Maybe they can introduce you to people. Maybe you can start to access some of kind of the quote unquote gatekeepers from some of these communities. And even if you can't go there yet, you can kind of set yourself up in that way. But also I think in a broad sense, as I mentioned before about non-instrumental time, building connections with people in the community you want to study, not just to kind of ask them questions, is a really important part of doing good fieldwork and becoming an expert in a certain region. So that's something I think that you can do, showing interest in people, not just related to your research, connecting online. I think that is a doable thing. And honestly, also a less sensitive thing, right? For concerns about what's going to happen. But for Hayal's great question about when to say no and shift back, again, these are somewhat necessarily a vague piece of advice because it's particular to the project, but I would say when you are going to cause harm or put your subjects or people you're working with at significant risk, you know, I would certainly be pulling back then. And then also for yourself as a researcher, you know, if you're doing your dissertation, you know, one of the great piece of advice you get is like the best dissertation is a done dissertation. So if you feel like you're putting out this really high risk, not high risk ethically, but high risk in terms of whether all the pieces are going to come together project, you know, you might want to rethink that because, you know, if you don't all of a sudden have something done and you're 5 years done in your program, you don't have any more funding, you know, it might be curtains for you in that sense. So I think you have to think first and foremost about the ethics of doing these projects amidst the pandemic and when to pull back to things that you can do, again, from your desk or building on other people's data, but also think about the logistical feasibility of this when we have so much uncertainty about when things will approach normal again.
Thank you. Hayal, would you like to contribute anything?
So I can say something a little bit about the practicality of how to do a research, like or how to do an interview in online settings. So first of all, keep in mind that like people are also kind of got used to somehow this kind of interactions, and they also know the kind of things that makes them comfortable or uncomfortable. So each time ask them which medium that they want to use. Maybe sometimes WhatsApp is better, voice messages are better, or kind of just phoning people and emailing, all the like different kind of mediums, and ask people what kind of mediums that they want to use, right? And make sure that they are comfortable with that. And we all have our own lives in WhatsApp, on Facebook, on Twitter, right? Like as we hang out with people when we go to the fieldwork, hang out in these spaces. If there is some kind of particular group, Facebook group that is related to your research, then hang out with the people there. Like post comments, make friends, right? It's the kind of make yourself, your digital self, an entry into these spaces, attend their activities online, and then like find someone and ask people, okay, do you have anyone that you want to suggest and you think that it would be great to talk to? So all the kind of basic techniques we have as ethnographers can be applicable to do like research settings or in interview settings on online platforms. And for the like one technical issue, for instance, like we should also acknowledge digital inequality, right? People do not have access to data as you do. In many countries, they have like data restrictions. So like add, for instance, buying data bundle into your research budget, right? Not giving kind of gift, but this could be a kind of concern. And I know that we don't have much time, but yeah, my general comments.
Thank you so much. There's a tremendous amount that's been put on the table, and I've seen a few other conversations that people have had about fieldwork during COVID, and what I'm particularly heartened by in this conversation is the extent to which ethics have come to the forefront, and especially the attention paid to what might be called hierarchies between researchers, and how this moment, this pandemic moment, this inability to travel, this reliance on digital communication might be reinforcing those or reproducing those hierarchies, and the suggestions that people here have given on how we can push back against that. both in the short term and the medium and even long term. I think that's been tremendously useful. There's a lot of questions that have been asked in the Q&A, so I encourage those of you who haven't had a chance to hear a response to your question to reach out to our panelists directly. They're easy to reach online. Easy to reach, they're reachable online. And I'd like to invite all of you to join us on November 4th for our next Crown Center event, which is Planning Beirut for the War to Come, a Crown seminar with Hibabu Akar from Columbia University. The discussant will be Huma Gupta, who's the Neubauer Junior Research Fellow. Golnar had the Neubauer Junior Research Fellowship when she was here, and Huma Gupta is the current holder. That'll be November 4th from 11 to 12, and you need to register on Zoom for the login, and I'll post that in the chat. So I'm going to turn over now to Gary Seymour, the director of the Crown Center, to wrap us up.
Thank you, David. Well, I just want to thank David and Golnar, Peter, and Hayal for making this such a successful session. I want to thank the audience for being very attentive and asking excellent questions. In fact, we really didn't have enough time. So one thing we'll have to consider is whether we want to expand the length of these seminars in the future. We're going to post a link to the recording of this meeting online, so please share it with your friends and encourage them to join us for the next session on November 4. I hope to see all of you then. Thank you and stay safe.
Thank you so much for having us.